Hi. So, y'all just keep congregating, talking to each other. It's great. I'll just mumble up here. For the speakers, it is interesting, like to be speaking like to a post, right in the middle of things. So I'll try to make sure that I'm not missing folks. So we have until when?
We're going to go to, 12:10.
We're going to go till 12:10.
Yeah.
Is that and if you really have to go to the bathroom before then, just go.
We're going to shave about 10 minutes off of our lunch break because of our sins of the morning. But you still have 50 minutes. That's plenty of time.
Okay. So the first thing that I'd like to do is to just say how grateful I am to be here. It's very humbling to be in a room with people who are working as hard as everyone is to follow Jesus. Would it be fair to say, I think following Jesus is really hard, and more days than not, I don't feel very good at it. I tell people I'm not just a sinner, I'm a professional sinner. Because I think that anything that you've been doing for a long time and that you're really good at, you should be called a professional. And so this notion of following Jesus in a community that's doing so with each other is a really big deal. And if you're a community like this one is, that is working really hard with other really hard work as part of that mission of following Jesus, gatherings like this become crucial. They become crucial for us to have connection with people, crucial for us to have opportunities for prayer, crucial for us to have opportunities for really being known by one another in really important ways. Some other things that are true about me is that, let's see, I was born and raised in Ohio. Did my education, medical school training there, got married, moved to Philadelphia where we lived here in Conshohocken for 4 years when I was in training at Temple University Hospital, and then have spent most of the rest of our adult lives, my wife Phyllis and I, in Washington, D.C., where, as you know, I don't know if many of you know that there's an election this year. And if you're from Washington and you're a psychiatrist, it's really kind of a good thing because you're never really going to be out of a job. Because before elections, everybody's anxious, and afterwards, everybody's depressed, and there's always prescriptions. And so we're satisfied to stay there. We have a daughter who's 25 and who finished a year ago at Duke Divinity School, and who will in 2 months be taking her first associate pastor's job. And then a son who's finishing his fourth year of undergraduate work at a place called Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. And I mention those relationships because those three people have probably been more life-shaping to me than anybody else on the planet in the last 30 years. And they've been graciously patient, right, with all that they've had to put up with. My children are really glad that their mother's on the planet because they'd probably be dead by now if it weren't for her. So again, all this to say is that to be in the world is hard. You add trauma on top of that, and you know what you get. My hope today is that the things that I have to share with you will be an additional tool, a way for us to think about what is God doing in this world of trauma. But mostly, it's not intended to be a matter of information download, although we're going to talk about information. The real question that I would have for me and for us in this room today is, what is God doing right here and now today in this next few hours? It's like I've been here since 8 o'clock. It's already clear that God has been on the loose in this group. I think when Harriet was introducing us earlier, he might have left the building for a while. But I mean, I think because there was that one moment, just a wrinkle in the matrix, right? You know. Yeah. But truly, this is a space where we don't just come to learn things and fill up the left side of our brain with information, right? This is a space where the Holy Spirit is really transforming people so that we can be agents of that transformation as we partner with God going forward. And I just want to thank our worship team for a great, it was just really great to walk in this morning after my drive from DC to walk into that worship time. And then Daryl, your presentation just really, met me in a place where I really have already needed to be met. And so I'm just really grateful to be here. So you all have handouts, and you might see there's a lot of information on the handouts, and they're not going to be on the slides up here. I'm going to invite you to follow these. We're going to move at a pace that might feel a bit brisk, but it's not a pace that we can't change, right? We can change our pace, and we can pause, and we can look for opportunities for questions and so forth. What I'm going to try to do, I think for both of these sessions, is I'm going to try to give us about 15 or 20 minutes, I think, if we can, toward the end for Q&A in each session. It's possible that I will completely forget that, and I will just yap as long as you'll let me yap. But the hope is for us not just, again, to just acquire information, but for us to be engaged with the material over the time. And I want us to, I want to introduce this notion that we're going to talk about this notion of interpersonal neurobiology, and it's going to be woven throughout our conversation over the next couple of hours. I want to suggest that this is a notion, this idea of interpersonal neurobiology, is a way of thinking about the way the world operates. But let me suggest it is a context. It is a way of putting on a certain set of contextual glasses, but I want to suggest it is also a pair of glasses that God has created. It's not just something that we are totally making up. We're doing this because this is part of the creation that we are simply identifying is here. And what I'm going to suggest is that what we're learning about neuroscience, the way the brain works and relationships and so forth, is God's affirmation of what we read about in the book of Acts, where it is written that God does not leave himself without a witness. We live in an age in the West in which talk about God kind of goes in one ear and out the other. All of our motifs, all of our metaphors are just kind of so much white noise. But, it's interesting. People listen to neuroscience, right? If you want to sell more yogurt, all you need to do is to put a picture of a brain, right, on your marketing advertisement material, and you will sell gallons of yogurt. That's how much power science currently has. But we want to understand science in its proper context. We think that it is a gift from God. It is not God. And we also have to be careful about that as well, that neuroscience tells us some things, but it is not everything. So I begin with this, that trauma takes place in an age of, you'll notice these words, in an age of uncertainty, anxiety, curiosity, mindful relationships, and then goodness, beauty, and proper confidence. And just quickly, I just want to say, yes, in some respects in 2016, it feels like it's very different because of particular political races that are taking place. But in many respects, it's really not that different from the 4th chapter of Genesis. It's an age of uncertainty. And one of the things we'd say, why do we say, well, Isaac Newton and Mr. Heisenberg, if you know much about physics, right? Isaac Newton was a physicist who talked an awful lot about certainty. Out of his work came this notion that we can be certain about the world. We know how fast an apple falls to the earth. And it's that way all the way, everywhere we go. But then Heisenberg comes along and says, as it turns out, the world is not nearly quite as simple in the world of physics. It's not nearly as certain. We actually live in a world of probabilities, not certainties. But since the dawn of time, human beings really, really are interested in being certain about things. I want to know that I know that I know, hence the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I want to know things. I want to suggest that the notion of relationship categorically won't let you know things in that way. We can be probable in relationships. I can't be certain. I can't know for a fact that I get to be in charge of everything that's going to happen. Anybody here married? Yeah, there you go. Need I say more? Right? We all, people who are married, you got married thinking that you were certain. And 6 days later, right? You know how that goes, right? So we live in a world, and here's the thing, we live in a world in which probabilities are really the rule, not certainty. The problem is that in our broken state, we live as if we expect things to be certain. The brain gets really anxious when its expectations of certainty are not met. So one of the things I want to begin with is that, I want to invite you to live in the real world. And the real world is a world of trust, a world of relationship. This is the world that God has made, not a world of certainty in the way that we typically, humans, like to think that certainty operates. But when we can't be certain, we get anxious. And when we're anxious, if you've anybody here educating little kids, you know that the more anxious they are, it's harder for them to be curious. Kids are naturally curious. And by the time they get to 3rd grade, we make them so anxious about not getting into the next middle school so they can get into the right high school so they can all go to Yale. But New Haven's a great place, don't get me wrong, right? But we make ourselves anxious, and because we're anxious, we can't be curious. I loved the question number 3 that you offered, Daryl, right? Like, what's the difference between what's urgent with this versus what is important? Because I'm anxious, right? Because ultimately, I don't really believe in this moment that God really is not anxious about this. We tell parents all the time, we work with adolescents in our practice, we tell parents, God's not worried about your kid. And they're like, well, he should be. And I've got a word for him. Right? We're anxious about our kids. My kids are 25 and 22, and I'm still anxious. Right? I'm the psychiatrist who says, do what I say, not what I do. Right? Because I'm anxious. We're anxious about these things. But what we want to invite us to do is to be in a place of greater curiosity, more mindfulness, and I want to suggest a place in which we are paying attention to a God who is creating a world of goodness and beauty. It's difficult to look at trauma and think beauty. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to think Good Friday and think beauty simultaneously. But the biblical narrative would say there was nothing so beautiful as a crucified Lord. And here's the thing. The thing is, we all have those parts of us that are represented by a man beaten, stripped naked, hung on a cross that we don't want anybody else to see either. You see, this talk is not just about how can we take this information and apply it to the people we're working with. This is about what are we doing about us. And this world of goodness and beauty also includes and requires us to be paying attention to the question of what I noticed are plausibility structures, these notions of how we are seeing things, the structure in which we understand the world, but often the structure that I don't even know that I'm looking at the world through, right? I don't even know that, like the fish, right? Doesn't know he's swimming in water, right? We have to work at being aware that the biblical narrative is not the American narrative. That the biblical narrative is not the Middle Eastern narrative. I had the opportunity to spend a week in Nazareth back in November. And it's like we Americans don't have a corner on the market at believing that our culture is the Christian culture. Like everybody does. Give us enough time. I want to suggest that a crucial feature of what it means for us to be agents of healing in trauma from an interpersonal neurobiological perspective is the notion of what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, the 2nd and 3rd verses. There are those who think they know, who do not know as they ought, St. Paul writes. But the person who loves God is known by God. Now, the verse strikes me because he doesn't say the person who loves God knows God. Because actually to know things as a human being requires a certain activity and part of my brain that is very different from the act of being known by others. For me to know things means I get to ask the questions. I get to decide what the questions are. Therefore, I decide what the limits of the answers are because the answers can only be limited to the questions that I ask. Does that make sense? But that's a very different experience than when someone comes and asks you questions, right? I'd like to be the scientist who sets the parameters for the experiment whereby which I judge what what I'm going to know. But if I'm the person who's asked questions, right? If you're coming to a therapist's office, like holy cow, like all bets are like, who knows what goes on beyond that door, right? Because then people start asking you questions about things that you didn't even know you didn't know, right? These things are happening all the time. So I don't know how much you've talked about storytelling here. We've heard it, like everybody has a story, right? One thing that we say about storytelling is like, we don't just have stories like in the abstract. We have stories because we want to tell them, and we want them to be heard by somebody else. And the reality is my story doesn't make any sense. My brain can't make sense of my story until somebody else hears it. My brain needs your brain in order for my story to make sense. This is what the neuroscience would tell us, all right? This work of creating space, whether they're refugees that are in Syria or refugees that are like in South Philly, this sense of creating space for others is a way to create the opportunity whereby which the Holy Spirit does work in between people. Brain has 100 billion neurons. You take one neuron by itself, really elegant, it can't really do very much. Put 100 billion of them together, and you get that skyline. You get Tchaikovsky. You get the Bible. But God is this synaptic cleft, right? These neurons have these junctures between them, right? There's these people, right? And this work that takes place in the synapse, this work that takes place in between neurons. God is always working. I have a spiritual director who said, it's important to know, Curt, that there's no human interaction between two people that is not mediated by Jesus. The question is whether or not we're paying attention to it. I have to be honest, I just don't pay that, my attention span is like, that of a gnat at times. You just ask my wife, right? It's very short, much shorter than I wish it were. So to what degree are we actually creating space for people to be known? I want to suggest to you that with every encounter you have with the person at the grocery checkout line, the opportunity to be known emerges. The question is, are we paying attention? All right, so just a little primer on like this lens of interpersonal neurobiology so that we can talk a little bit about it. You'll have an understanding what it is. It's printed out there on your handout. You can read about what it is. The basic notion is that there are lots of different science disciplines that come together that all have in common an interest in what the mind is and how the mind functions. But for many, many years, none of them ever talked to one another, right? So the neurobiologists, the ones who studied neurons in rats, didn't really talk much to child psychiatrists. They had no reason to. But there is this notion of consilience, this notion that comes from the biologist E.O. Wilson, this notion that there are things that we share in common. And what are those common things that teach us some things about the mind? Well, when you look at that from an interpersonal neurobiology context, when it comes to the mind, when it comes to this thing with which we are being asked to love God with all of it, what would that be? To love God with all of my mind, with all my heart, with all my soul, with my strength, all those. What does it mean for us to do that? What is the mind? Important to remember, in Romans 1:20, St. Paul writes that from the beginning of time, man has known from looking at the creation about God's nature and his power. So we want to again suggest that what we're talking about is evidence from the world that God has made. And that evidence would suggest that the working definition of the mind goes something like this, that the mind is an emerging process that is both embodied and relational, whose task it is to, read that right, whose task it is to regulate the flow of energy and information. You got that, right? And just, okay, repeat that. Just say it. Don't look at your paper, right? The mind, and again, if you're going to work on trauma, would it be fair to say that we want to actually work to heal a person's mind? Like we're in that business. Would that be fair to say? Right. I mean, other things are important too, but the mind is one thing that we want to pay attention to. So if we're in the business of healing, or we're in the business of working with trauma, what is that which is being healed? So the mind is a process. First of all, it's a process that emerges from within brains, between brains, but it is both embodied and relational. It's important to know that your mind is not restricted to your brain. When you're anxious, how do you know you're anxious? Right, your body tells you. If you cut your body off at your neck, well, really bad things would happen. But I mean, if you cut your body off at your neck, right, you couldn't tell that your palms were sweaty because you wouldn't have access to them, right? You wouldn't have access to your heart. You wouldn't have access to your breathing. Our bodies are important. They are an important part of our mind. Remember, our plausibility structure in the West tends to separate these things, right? Cartesian dualism tends to tell us that we think and feel. That's over here in this back 40 acres, and over here is what we do with our bodies. These things our bodies don't have anything to do with our minds. They have everything to do with your mind. It is embodied. It's not just embrained, but it's also relational. If the mind is relational, it means that nobody here in the room got to where you are in this room without the help of somebody else. And I mean by that, like when you're born, they don't just like lay you on the table and say, hey, good luck. Kind of chilly now, isn't it? No, we're not giving you any blankets. You're an American. You can do it on your own. No, we don't do that, right? We are paying attention to others. Others are paying attention to us. The question is, to what degree am I being paid attention to? We'll talk about attachment later. To what degree am I being paid attention to, and to what degree is that allowing my brain to actually emerge, right? So that our neurons even wire in the way that they should or that they want to in really healthy ways depends completely upon the interrelational experiences that I have. Our brains don't get to be where they are, and our brains can't continue to work into integrated states, which we'll talk about in a moment, until and or unless we are regularly in relationships in which we are known. To the degree that we are not in relationships, that would be like, this isn't just for the refugees. This isn't just for, this is for us. To the degree that we are not in relationships in which we are being regularly known, the degree of integration that our minds can experience, the degree to which we can then love God with all of it will be diminished. So the mind is embodied, it's relational, it emerges, meaning that it becomes larger than the sum of its parts. There's more to you than you know, Frodo. Right? There's more to us than we know. And so much of who we are that we can become depends upon those relational interactions. Certain things that we can't know about ourselves until someone else calls them forth, quite literally. Who are the people who are doing that with and for you on a regular basis? And then the last thing we say that its task is to regulate the flow of energy and information. And by this, we would say that this notion of energy really is the neurobiochemical interactions that take place. All this biochemistry, these electrical firings that take place in all through your neurons. But every time that happens, we've got some other kind of meaning making that we put into that. If we were to take, we were to crack your skull, take a probe, we wouldn't do that. We might do that with rats. But if we were to put a probe in your brain, and turn it on, we activate your awareness and sense of like an apple. Or we give you a certain aroma, right? So we know that like you have an experience that is always embodied. People are sent to me and they say, well, my therapist sent me because I have a chemical imbalance. I say, do you root for the Duke Blue Devils? They say yes. I say, yes, you have a chemical imbalance. Right? Because our bodies and our meaning making are never separated. Our bodies and our meaning making are never separated, which is why it shouldn't shock us that 60 to 90% of all communication is nonverbal, body dependent. Right? It's not just about like giving, like the gospel is not just about giving people information. This notion of the mind, I would suggest, we've heard about a long time ago when we read in Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, and God said, let us make mankind in our image. And God, let us, right? It's a corporate, it's not a monad. We're told that we serve a corporate God, this like relational. Let us make mankind, like you don't belong to you, as it turns out. Like we're not made that way. That's not how our brains work. You are we. Now it doesn't mean that you aren't you at all. It simply means that you're not only you. Let us make mankind. Right? God is reflecting on this too, right? We are reflective beings. And you can imagine, like the Holy Trinity having this conversation, right? It's the one thing, if you look at Genesis chapter 1, it starts like, and day 1, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. You know, right? And then there was this, and there was that, and he just said, you do. He gets to verse 26, and then it says, and God said, let us make mankind. He doesn't say, and God said, let there be mankind, and there was mankind. He has a conversation. He's reflective. Perhaps because he knows what he's about to get into, right? You can imagine, like, and God said, let us make mankind, and Jesus is like, I'm not so sure about this. Because I see how this movie ends. I'm not really sure that I like this idea. You know, and the father's like, dude, it's okay. Like 3 days later, like it's big time, right? Like, but you see what I mean? Like there is reflection. God's not a God who just operates automatically. This is how we are made, in that image. But we are also made in the image of Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the earth, and he breathed the breath of life into man's nostrils, and man became a living being, right? We are dirt and we are breath, and we are both or we are nothing, right? This is the mind that we're talking about. This is the mind that is traumatized. Recognizing that you can't traumatize a person without traumatizing a community, because they're inseparable. You can't traumatize a community without there being individuals who are explicitly traumatized. There's no like one or the other. This is really hard, isn't it? Because like we're working to like, can you imagine Jesus coming, like seeing everything, and it just like, no wonder he only stayed 33 years. I mean, like just to keep doing this forever? It's a long, right? Okay. We're going to talk about different domains of integration in just a moment, but like this notion that God takes who we are in our entirety very seriously is something that we don't take that seriously, relatively speaking. For us to be helpful, for us, you know, if we believe that we live in a world in which God has invaded it with the purpose of changing it, transforming it, I love that, right? With the transformation of culture, right? If transformation is going to happen to culture, change doesn't happen while human beings change, right? And if human beings are going to change, as far as like this stuff is concerned, it has everything to do with how the brain changes. And that has everything to do with the little thing that we call neuroplasticity. Now, 25 years ago, when I was a resident right up the street here, right up the street, working in the VA, if you had a stroke, you got maybe 2 hours per day of occupational or physical therapy for maybe 6 weeks while you're in the hospital, and then you're sent home and you're prayed for and you're hoped that all would work out. But things didn't go that well. Now, if you have a stroke, we send you to a rehab center, probably here, or maybe the one in D.C. or one in Birmingham, Alabama, where for 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, you will work, because of what we've seen that happens with neuroplastic change, the brain's capacity to change. Now, it's not heroic. If, like, you lose your frontal lobe, we can't just, like, magically bring it back. But there are certain things that we know, Norman Doidge, The Brain That Changes Itself. I highly recommend this book, The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. He gives like about a dozen different case examples of people whose brains are moving in one direction that's really, really bad news, and yet they begin to do things that indicate that the brain has far more capacity for change than we would originally think. And we would say, well, of course, now that we're learning these things, like changing the brain is important part of how God changes us. Right? God can't really change us without changing our brain, because we are dirt and we are breath. These things are inseparable. And if we want things to change, here are some things for us to keep in mind. That what we really want to do, we want to snag the brain. If we're talking about healing trauma, we want to stimulate neuronal activation and growth. Neurons tend to change in 3 different ways. One, we learned that the brain can grow new neurons. That's a surprising, relatively new event. It can grow neurons. Number 2, the neurons that we have can actually grow larger with greater activity. And number 3, those neurons that grow larger and are new can have greater connection with one another. And with more connection comes more effective interaction between different neurons' states. You might think like, gosh, so what? Well, I want to suggest to us that when a person tells you their story after living for 3 or 13 years in a refugee camp, when they tell the story of their life to someone for the first time who's really listening, your listening to them changes the neural firing patterns in their brain. When St. Paul says Don't be conformed to this world. Instead, be renewed by the transforming of your mind. Like, he's not kidding. That's what we do. Like, Jesus, like, this is not catching God by surprise. Like, well, of course. I'm just waiting for the technology to catch up with y'all. We stimulate neuronal activation and growth by practicing what it means to be known. This is what we do. This is what you do. There are some ways for us to facilitate this, to enhance this, because if we want to make changes, we're going to talk about all this other stuff. We want changes to happen. If we want changes to happen, there are 6 things you can do. As we say to people, like, you can't give people what you don't have. So if we're not doing these things, it's hard for us to convincingly give these to others. First 3 have a lot to do with the body. The first would be aerobic exercise. And by aerobic exercise, we mean just like walking, right? People are like, well, like we live in a world where like aerobic exercise is this thing that we cordon off into our hour in the gym, right? I just kind of go do that. And that's not a bad thing, but any time that we can move the body is a good thing. Aerobic exercise enhances neuronal fluidity, right? Number 1. Number 2, sleep. We sleep on average 2 hours per night less in the US than we did 100 years ago. Now, for one night, not a bad deal, but for like 4 weeks, for 6 months, for like 53 years, not that I'm that old, but for 53 years, right, that has an impact on the brain, right? Including like raising your risk for Alzheimer's disease when we don't sleep well, because like the brain doesn't have an opportunity to like clean things up at night because we're not sleeping well. So sleep. So aerobic exercise, sleep, food intake. Now, for some of us who work in places where like we don't have what we have here in the U.S., we tell U.S. citizens, look, there's 2 things that you can do that will help your food intake. Number 1, slow your pace. Eat more slowly. So the first thing I would say is like, next time you have a meal, it's going to be kind of hard today. Well, we have 50 minutes, right, for the lunch? That's plenty. All right, hurry up, right? After lunch today, slow down your intake, okay? But after lunch, right? If we slow down, we eat less, right? If we slow down our intake, right? Slow down. Number 1, we can probably afford, like for those of us who are typically like not that, like me, like we could probably afford to eat half of what we eat. We could probably afford to eat half of what we eat. So imagine that, but like, Curt, like what do? I have less to eat, which should take me even shorter, but now you're making me eat like longer. Right? And if I'm supposed to go exercise, like I'm not going to have any more time, right? Because it's all filled with like aerobic exercise and like eating over a long period of time, right? It's important. And remember, did we say like this is really hard work? As we say in the business, right? Life is actually not that complicated. It's not complicated. It's really hard. Like life is very simple and it's very hard. But it's not hard because it's complicated. It's hard because it's painful, right? Getting a shot, it's really not that complicated. Painful. Those are 3 things. Here are 3 other things. Number 1, mindfulness activities. What am I doing to practice being aware of the present moment? Whether it's through spiritual disciplines, listening prayer, meditation, journaling, anything that I can do to keep my attentional mechanism focused right where I want it to be focused. Mindfulness practices. Number 2, meaningful novelty. What am I doing to create space for me to be creative in new ways? By meaningful novelty, we mean those things that are new, right? But those things, so novel, but those things that are also meaningful. So for instance, you could memorize the phone book. They don't have phone books anymore, but like if we had a phone book, you could memorize that, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about things that are meaningful. So now many of you like know multiple languages, but if you didn't, I would say, learn another language that you then put into practice. I would say, like, I don't care how old you are, like, begin to practice, take lessons on a new instrument. Move to North Carolina and make furniture, whatever you want to do, right? To be creative. Write more, right? Anything that we're doing that engages, especially the right hemisphere, in activity that is novel, enhances neuroplastic change. And then the last thing is this. Deeply connected interpersonal relationships. The very act of having deeply connected interpersonal relationships enhances the brain's capacity to be more flexible and adaptive. So those 6 things we can put into practice pretty quickly in order for us then to move on to this notion of what we call integration. Now, I don't know if that's a word that we use here commonly for other things, but here's what we mean by the word integration in the language of interpersonal neurobiology. Integration speaks to this notion. I'll give you an example. If you ran a company, you'd have multiple different divisions in your company. You'd have sales and marketing and R&D and so forth and so on, right? And you'd want to capitalize all of them. You'd want the R&D folks to be able to make great stuff. You'd want the marketing stuff to really market well, sell, so forth and so on. That is what we would call differentiation. We want each different part of the mind, part of the company, to be well differentiated. Whatever they're supposed to do, they get lots of specific practice and exercise doing that. In an organization, the same thing applies. Each part gets specific, explicit help doing the best they can at what they're supposed to do. But they're not going to do very well if they're not connected to the other parts of the organization, right? This is where linkage comes in, right? It's not going to really help my company much if I'm selling things that I'm not making, okay? The job of any CEO is to help integration take place. The job of your prefrontal cortex is the job to help different functions of your mind, different domains of your mind, which we'll talk about really quickly here, to come together in order for them to be well differentiated and also well linked. So what happens if, like, we grow up in homes where emotion doesn't really get much airplay, where we don't really talk much about emotional states? We don't do that. We kind of like live out of the left side of our brain. That means that, like, that doesn't mean emotion isn't happening. It's happening all the time. I'm just not paying attention to it, nor do I know what to do with it, right? Until it explodes in my kitchen, right? So there are different elements of our mind's activity that are going to be important for us to both differentiate. And that means for us, if we're going to be helpful for other people, we also have to have those elements in our own minds well differentiated, but also then linked. And it's this work of linkage and differentiation that takes so much effort. This linkage and differentiation is expressed in the 86th Psalm, the 11th verse, where the writer says, "Teach me your way, that I may walk in your truth. Teach me your way, that I may walk in your truth. Create within me an undivided heart." An undivided heart. Like, I've got these different parts of me that are typically divided. Create within me an undivided heart. Notice he doesn't say, create within me a homogeneous heart. It all looks the same. No, it doesn't all look the same. But it really takes a lot of hard work to be with someone that's really different than you, like your spouse, right? How do you both be with, like, this whole one flesh union thing? Like, that's just strange, right? How do you do that? Both be different and linked. How do you live in a church? Be different and linked. Because here's the other variable. There's only so much energy to go around. You don't have an infinite amount of energy to different. You don't have like an infinite like source of income to just like pay whatever you need to pay to make sure that everybody gets what they need. There's only so much money to go around, and so some of that energy is going to have to be burned in differentiation, but some of it's going to have to be burned in linkage, and we don't always know how much to spend on each one at any given time. Does that make sense? Again, back to this notion that I would like to be certain of how to do all this. At the end of the day, when you have all this information, it's like, okay, so where's the one sentence where I can just say, like, oh, just do this, and then everything falls right into place? Yeah, that sentence isn't coming. Right, and the reason is because, like, God's not worried about this, as Leslie Newbegin. Like, Newbegin has been, like, even though he's dead, I don't think he's really dead. Did you know, anybody know Leslie Newbegin? I don't mean, like, personally. Well, you might have known him personally. If you still know him personally, I would be concerned, right? Because he's dead. But in his commentary on John, he said, just because the disciples' witness was imperfect did not mean it was ineffective. Jesus is not worried about our witness, about our lives being imperfect. He's not worried about, like, he knows they're imperfect. He's not worried about this. We're going to talk about this when we come to shame. He's not worried about this. Because just because things are imperfect does not mean it's ineffective. God is paying attention to things that are effective. He's not paying attention to things that are defective. He's not worried about that. He's just working on them. Moving to a state of integration then means that I can only be helpful for those people who are traumatized effectively over time to the degree that I am also doing the work of allowing integration to take place within my own experience. We have a little acronym there called FACES. Stands for flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, stable. It's an acronym that we use when talking about anything. Talk about patients, talk about your child, talk about systems. Is the system, is the person, am I today? Where am I at any given point? How flexible am I? Right? How flexible, how adaptive, how coherent, how energized, how stable. These words, you think, well, they all sound kind of similar. They're all the same thing. But we really do, I won't go into all the details now, but in the language of interpersonal neurobiology, we have specific meanings for these things. But it's a handy acronym for us to keep in mind, for us to just ask, well, how flexible am I? How energized am I feeling at this point in time? Because maybe I need a nap, right? But like, you're probably going to be thinking that, like around 1:30 this afternoon. Or that's a joke, like, because I'll be talking. I know, it's been a long week, hasn't it? Right. I can tell, like, it's been a long week for you, because this morning, right? Right? Right. You're right. Very good. Right. Right on. Yeah. So it's a helpful way for us to, like, imagine, like, what is the system? What is my mind? What is any of it? What are we doing at any given point in time? Another way then for us to like extend this notion of integration, we talk about 9 different domains, and we're going to kind of move pretty quickly through this. Okay, we're not doing so bad. Move pretty quickly through these 9 different domains, and why again? You know, they're kind of, we'd say in some respects, my friend and colleague Dan Siegel, who's been kind of the point of the spear of this whole notion of interpersonal neurobiology, constructed these ideas, and we would say this is a way of thinking about the mind. This is not like the only way, the best way, the absolute right way, but it is an effective way, I think, of thinking about the way the mind works. And here's a first thing for us to imagine. Keeping this in mind, if you look at Genesis 1, how things were made, and then if you look at Genesis 2, how things were made, and then you look at the brain, we'd say, like, there's some things about the way the brain operates that really are kind of reflective of. Now, we're not trying to, like, paste science into Scripture or vice versa. But in general, we say this, that the brain operates bottom to top and right to left. This is the way the brain tends to work, in general. Bottom to top and right to left. And that's, I want you to keep that in mind. Bottom to top and right to left. As we proceed through these 9 domains, I hope that that phrase will make more and more sense to us. The first domain is the domain of consciousness. We'd like to say, like, there are 3 A's to this, consciousness. Is the person, in this case me, am I first awake, am I alert, and am I attuned? Nobody knows what consciousness is. All the research that's out there right now in neuroscience about what, and there are people who are doing this, nobody knows. Not because nobody's trying to figure it out. We are, but it's that mysterious. It's that difficult to come up with. But there are some things that we know are true of people who are conscious, at least we think. We would say that they're awake, we think they're alert, and we think they're attuned. Much of our waking lives are spent awake. Most of that is alert. Not all of it is attuned. I can only be attuned even then to someone outside of myself, to the degree that I'm actually first attuned to what's going on inside of me. If you were to think about a radar station, whose job it is, at the airport to pick up like where the planes are. The radar station itself is functioning pretty well, and it's telling you where the planes are. But what if there's nobody there? Not very helpful, right? The station can be working, but I don't have anybody who's actually reading what the station is telling me. This is what happens for many of us inside our brains, right? The station is on, but nobody's at home working there. Right? This is what happens because so you've given examples already this morning. Like we want to go in and talk to refugees, and we want to talk, right? Because I'm awake and I'm alert, because I have to be alert to talk. Believe me, it'd be a problem for you if I'm not alert. But am I attuned? Am I attuned? And the degree to which I'm able to be attuned to you, truly attuned to you, first depends upon the degree to which I'm actually attuned to what's happening inside of me. Because if I'm not attuned to what's happening inside of me, I'm not paying attention to the mechanisms that are telling me what's coming to me from you. It's like having the radar station that is on but nobody's home. I have to be paying attention to the radar when it's picking something up, as opposed to just operating automatically, which is what much of our waking hours are, how much more are lived. In Romans chapter 8, the writer talks about how the spirit of life, right? The mind that is on the spirit is life. The mind that is on the flesh is death. It doesn't say it's like will be death, like it is death. Like on what are our minds focused? The hallmark of this domain of the mind is the hallmark of attention. How well are we paying attention to what we're paying attention to? There's nothing that we do that is not requiring a shift in functional attention, whether that's involuntary and automatic, right? Bird hits the window, we all turn. Sorry, right? We say to the bird, right? That's an automatic turning of the attention. Or we pay attention with intention to something else. How well are we paying attention to what we're paying attention to? Then we move to the second domain. Again, bottom to top, right to left. If I'm awake, that's telling me then that this next domain is the vertical domain of the mind. And by vertical, we literally mean, if you're standing up, really the body, right? And if you've heard my friend Dan or me do this before, if you all hold your hands up like this, or done this, right? Okay. Yeah, we're all looking around. What does a psychiatrist do in a room full of people hold up their hands? All right, thank you. Put your hand down. You suspect something like unpleasant's about to happen, don't you? Imagine for a moment that your forearm is your spinal cord. The top of your spinal cord is your brain stem. Your brain stem is that which houses all the most of the neurons that are responsible for most of your involuntary automatic behaviors, right? Heart rate, blood pressure, sex drive, appetite drive, a lot of things. Very small space, but very well protected by bone. No thinking takes place here. Right? No, right? Bless you. No thinking takes place here. And for men, that's about as good as we get, right? Because this we have in common with reptiles. We call it the reptilian brain, right? Right, bottom to top, right? What we sense from our world, both outside and inside, comes into the spinal cord, goes up the spinal cord, and through other parts that first come and filter through the brain stem, and then you take your thumb and you pass it over to the front of your hand. This becomes what we call your limbic circuitry. This is the next developmental stage of neurons, right? Which represents those neurons that largely or partially, but responsible for the emergence of what we call emotion. Okay? Emotion is that which we would say, as we'll talk about in just a minute, it's like it's the fuel in the tank. If you don't have any gas in the tank, it doesn't matter if you have a starter, right? If attention is the ignition key of the mind, it turns things on. If it's got no gas in the tank, it pays attention to nothing. Emotion. We say, well, he doesn't feel anything. Yes, he does. He's just not telling you. Okay? We feel things all the time. We are constantly regulating emotion. Limbic circuitry, but there's no thinking there either. Much like we have with dogs, not cats. Cats don't feel. They really don't. Curl your fingers over the top of your thumb. Now, if you can imagine, and you can because you're an imaginative group, this becomes like the top part of your brain, right? You can imagine that spongiform part of your brain, the cortex, the neocortex. You can go home and impress all your friends with this. This will be really great because in the front part of your hand, where your fingernails are, this represents your middle prefrontal cortex, that portion of the brain that really separates us from everything else on the planet. The portion of the brain that helps us think about what we're thinking about, helps us regulate what we feel. If you'll notice, literally, where it's anatomically located, it's located close to the limbic circuitry and not that far away from your brainstem, because much of the activity of the prefrontal cortex, its job is to regulate what the bottom part of the brain is sending to it all the time. We'd like to think that what we do between 6 in the morning and 11 at night, most of that is because we are humans. Here's the news. Most of what we do because of what we have in common with snakes and dogs, right? A lot of what we're doing is just automatically, right? We're just kind of coming and going. It's not bad. It's okay, right? That men are like snakes is okay. It's not a problem. But it's important to know that a great deal of what our prefrontal cortex's job is that of restraint. If you were to cut the neurons out of the brain whose task it is to restrain, the world would go crazy. Because so much of what our brain's job is about restraint. It's about regulating my limbic circuitry, regulating my brainstem. When trauma happens, my prefrontal cortex goes offline. My prefrontal cortex has a great deal of difficulty regulating all of that fight or flight stuff. All of that stuff that makes me feel things. It's very difficult. That then becomes the governing body of the rest of my mind. And remember, if my mind is not just what I think, my mind is my body, it dysregulates a lot. So if this vertical portion of my mind is going to be taken into consideration, integrated, we want to pay attention to it. Do you not know, 1 Corinthians 6:19, that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? You were bought with a price. You were bought, like your body was bought with a price. He doesn't say, do you not know that your mind is the temple of the Holy Spirit? Do you not know that your brain? Do you not know that your heart? Do you not? Your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. If I'm not paying attention to my body, I'm not paying attention to certain elements of my mind's experience that my God is trying to use to get my attention. Speaking with, we've done this, right? As people tell their stories, they don't just tell the story about an event, right? They tell the story about how the event is now embodied. Where in your body do you feel this? And they talk about it's right here in my solar plexus. And then you start to give them images, right? You give them all kinds of ways of telling the story about their body. And now my story is not just this thing that happened in the abstract 3 days ago or 3 years ago or 3 decades ago. It is a thing that my mind has captured and has right here. It's not a thing in the past. It is right here in your living room. And they carry it with them all the time. But they don't pay attention to this. Instead, they're just walking around trying to keep themselves from going crazy, burning lots and lots of energy trying to regulate all this stuff that the brain is sending to the prefrontal cortex, bottom to top, right to left. Does that make sense? All right. This is what happened the night that she was about 15. Now, this is not a story of horrible trauma. This is a story of my daughter. My daughter who's soon going to be an ordained minister, but who on that fateful night was about to be killed by her father. I'm not kidding. Our church had a week-long, they told us a week in advance, we're going to have a work detail on Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. At 8 o'clock in the morning. Okay? And everybody's going to go, and our family, we're going to go to a work detail. Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Did you hear that? Teenager, Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. Right? It's really bad karma. So I figure I'm going to be the good parent, and I'm going to start Sunday before. And I'm going to start to alert my kids that we're going to be doing this work detail. And you feel look, I've read good parenting books. Heck, I'm a psychiatrist. I've written a book or two. We're going to do this. We're going to let our kids know along the way, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we're reminding them at the dinner table, right? I'm thinking this is going to be pretty good. 8 o'clock's going to come. We're going to get up at 7:30 and go do this. Everything's going to be cool. 10 o'clock Friday night. I still see it. She's sitting on the counter in our kitchen. She's sitting on the counter. I'm leaning against the other counter. I'd say, it's a simple question. It's a simple answer. At what time do you want me to get you up in the morning? Have you ever seen a 15-year-old girl roll her eyes? Okay, she rolls her eyes. I reach for the meat cleaver. And I kid you not, you know how this is, right? You can't believe that you are about to commit a felony in your own kitchen and you don't care. Because if you if anybody here have children? Yeah. Right, so everybody has wanted to kill someone in your life, right? We know this. We know this to be true. And the thing is, it was one of those rare moments when I actually parented well. My wife was really proud of me, right, later, because I could feel my entire body stiffen. It's like you imagine, oh, this is what the cheetah feels right before it goes for the gazelle. And I feel my heart right here. Because And all these thoughts, you know how this is, like immediately race through your head. I've done my homework. I've done the parenting. We've talked about this at dinner. Ugh, ugh. And so I try to take one deep breath and I say, can we sit down and talk about this? Because, she's rolling her eyes. It's like, ugh. That's the other one, right? Ugh.
Could you do that again?
Oh, I only do it twice a month. And I just done it twice. And so here's what happens. You go over, you sit down, and here's when you sit down, what happens? Your blood pressure, lowers, right? Your heart rate lowers. Your breathing steadies. You create space, and then you ask questions. But my brainstem doesn't ask questions. My limbic circuitry doesn't ask questions, right? It's not in the business of asking questions, right? It's in the business of reaching for the meat cleaver. And so then the question becomes, well, what happens when we then create that distance? Well, what it does when you're paying attention to this vertical mind, you can say, well, can you help me to understand what's happening? And then she starts to talk about how hellish the last 3 days have been about school. And you recognize, it's not really even about having to get up tomorrow morning. I mean, I didn't want to have, this is at 10 o'clock at night. I thought this was going to last 7 seconds, not an hour. I don't want to be, you know how it is. 15-year-olds, they like to start to have conversation with their parents at 12:30 at midnight, right? This is when they start to have their conversation. So when they want to talk, you talk. Your body doesn't want to do that. But this is what we do to create space for people to be known. To pay attention also to their bodies. But I can't pay attention to her body in the eye roll. I'm just going to be reacting to it if I'm not paying attention to my own. Then we move to this third domain. This domain of the right and the left hemisphere, what we call the horizontal domain. We each have right and left hemispheres in the brains. They do different things, more differentiation. In the right hemisphere, we have all this emotional state. We have our not our memory, because it's not working right now for me, our visual spatial orientation, our nonverbal cues, all those kinds of things that come to us, that activate things quite automatically, and then send that information to our left brain, which largely is occupied by a language center. Not only that, these things are not absolute. It's not like there are no words that come to us from the right hemisphere, but largely on the left hemisphere, and our brain is constantly in this motion in which the right hemisphere is receiving things from the bottom part of the brain and sending that information to the left, in order for us to tell a story about it. And we're constantly telling stories. Some of those stories are shaped not just by language, but by things that we feel and sense and image and so forth. That's what that hemisphere is doing. How well do we pay attention to this? If I grow up in a family in which I don't have much practice turning emotion into language, it's like there being a 5-alarm fire that goes off, and I've got no idea to know what to do with it. There's no fire department to call. I don't have a language. I don't have a way for me to do things. Right? Imagine if you were here and you didn't know where the bathroom was, right? And you didn't have language to ask, where is the bathroom? But you really had to go. But you can't ask anybody because you don't have language. What do? You're wandering all over. Or you're peeing in your seat. I mean, it's one of the two. You're wandering. We just do these things because we need language in order for us to make sense of what the right hemisphere is sending to us. But many people have never had the chance to tell their story in which they can use language while looking at someone else to help them make sense of what's taking place within them. The degree to which we create space for people to do that helps their horizontal domain of the mind to become more integrated and more linked to other parts of their mind. Right? So that's 3. 4, memory. By memory, we're really talking about this notion of 2 different ways that we remember. First is we remember implicitly. Implicit memory starts before we're born, lasts until we're dead, and largely includes things that we remember but that we don't have to pay attention to in order to do so. So you learn to ride a bike. Now, you paid attention when you learned to ride a bike, but once you've learned, you don't have to go back and remember how to do that in the same way that you might have to remember test questions, right? You don't ride a bike for 10 years. You go back, you just get on the bike and go. When we leave here today, everybody's going to stand up and walk, and you're going to have to remember how to walk. Really? Yeah, you watch. There'll be some, you look around the table, they'll be like, I almost forgot, right? No, we're not going to, we just get up and walk, but we will remember how to walk. Or this. So the couple comes home at the end of the day, and they're in their kitchen, and they start to have a fight. And the fight is because he was supposed to have called his mother-in-law because it was her birthday. But it's not the first time that he's forgotten to call his mother-in-law that he promised his wife that he would do. And his wife, understandably, starts to get angry with him in the kitchen. After just a few minutes of being in the fight, he stops, leaves, goes outside, gets in his car, and takes off. Real story. Now, if you were to ask him, dude, why? Was this tactic helpful? Right? He might say, well, like, I know what happens. Like, if I get too angry, I don't want to say something that's going to ruin things. I need to, like, cool off. Or he might say, as he did, well, and I know how she gets when she blows. You know, like Katrina's got nothing on her. Right? He would not necessarily say, I think I was having an implicit memory of what it was like when I was 10 years old and I would come home and there would be my dad who was an alcoholic and raging, and the only outlet I had to take care of my fear was to get on my bike and take off. He would not say, I think we were having a fight, but my dad was standing behind my wife. My dad, who's now deceased. Implicit memory is active in our minds all the time. But how well are we paying attention to what we're paying attention to? That domain of memory. And then that domain then gets translated into our what we call explicit memory, how I remember events in time. But also then how I anticipate my future, because as we say, my future is always just an anticipated memory. The brain cannot anticipate something that it has not already experienced in some way, shape, or form. Right? What I pay attention to, I remember, and what I remember becomes my anticipated future. That's the way the brain works. To the degree that we're not paying attention to this movement, there are all kinds of ways in which my story gets told quite automatically apart from my intention of doing so in a way that is consistent with the gospel. Right? Because God wants to come and tell a different story. God comes and invites us into his story. The problem and the challenge for me is that my story is so dominated by all my implicit memory that I just keep telling my story the way it is until somebody else comes along and starts to ask me questions. This is our job, right? So who's asking us the questions that enable our story to be renewed in light of the gospel, such that we can then go and do the same? That's the memory domain. This next domain about narrative, we're going to wait until we talk about that about attachment later. After attachment, we have the next domain, which is that of state. Now, state, we like to say, is it's interesting. You've heard of the phrase state of mind, right? You've heard of that. It's a real thing, by the way. It's always been a real thing. It's just that we've now coined it, put a trademark on it, make money off of it. State of mind. So imagine this: if I'm at work at our office, and where I am all day, where I am master of the universe, my office, and at the end of the day, I go home, where I am not master of the universe. But so when you're at work, wherever you are, even right here, we enter into stable, neurally stable states that repeat themselves and stay in that state, whereby which lots of things start to automatically happen, right? And you just operate as if this is the case. You with me, right? The state of mind that I'm in when I'm at work is very different than the state of mind I would be in if I would wake up and plan to go play tennis. It's a different state of mind. I start to anticipate different things, whole different kettle of fish, different expectations. All that's very, very different. But if I'm not paying attention to the fact that I've actually come home, where I am not master of the universe, where somebody else is, or however that works, I'm not always sure. Challenging things will happen. And we like to say that a lot of our trouble as human beings happen in the middle of transitioning from one state to another. Now notice, states can be large, right? The state of what it would like for me to be at work. But even in those large states, we can have smaller compartmentalized states even within them. Right? You can be at work but have different tasks that you are set to do. So you can have even smaller states between which you have to transition from moment to moment to moment. The degree to which I'm able to do that transitioning effectively has everything to do with how well I'm paying attention to what I'm paying attention to. You know how it is. you give kids a 5-minute warning at their play date to let them know that we're going to go, right? And then like 60 seconds later, you say, well, it's 5 minutes is up, right? Because they can't tell time. They don't, you're right, you don't care, right? But you give them a warning, because it's what all the parenting books say, right? You give them a warning. It's an anticipatory way of helping people shift their expectations. Trauma obliterates that. It obliterates our capacity. It obliterates our capacity to adequately anticipate changes in state. My brain requires that kind of transition in order for me to move fluidly through the world. And if I can't predict safety in transitioning from one state to another, I will constantly be more and more and more anxious because I won't know when the state is changing. Does that make sense? And so part of what we do when we do trauma work is we are trying to help people's states of mind become more stable. Now, here's the thing. You might think, like, well, this is all fine and good, like all this, like these ideas and words, what would it make a difference if you actually tell people this? As it turns out, yes, it does. When we start to tell people, like, if you imagine being in this place, being at work, being at home, being at church, can you imagine that these are different places to be? Oh, yeah. Have you ever had, like, as we say, well, I think that we should have, like, drive-through confessionals at churches so that people can, like, just, like, all the fights that they have on the way to church, the families, they can just, like, drive through, they just confess even before they go in the church doors, right? Because we're not transitioning very well, like, from our house to the church. What would happen if we were practicing ways in which we help people anticipate changes so that their states are able to be stabilized? Does that make sense? Okay. The next domain that we want to work to integrate is that of the interpersonal domain. Now, we could spend a long time with this, but suffice to say is this. My guess is, at least this is true for me, my guess is as we think about all these states so far, we tend to think about them in terms of like, well, what my state is. We have to recognize also that everybody else on the planet is doing the same work, and that my states are all going to be subject to the states of other people. Does that make sense? We say, like, oh yeah, sure, that makes sense. But like, but am I aware of the degree to which that is the case? Am I aware of the degree to which my state is going to affect somebody else's state? It's important to know that. And you know, men, I don't mean to pick on my own gender, but like now I don't know. I can only speak for me because I've never been a woman, so I don't know about this. But one thing I notice about men is like it's hard for us. Check me on this, Phil. It's hard for us. It's hard for me to walk into a room and believe that I actually carry much emotional effect on other people. Would that be fair to say? Right, I run this men's group that lasts for 10 months, and like it's challenging. Like and these are like effective men. These are men who do really like cool things in their life and so forth. But almost to a person, their sense of being persuaded that they actually emotionally like make a difference in the world. This is where shame's going to come in. We're going to talk about that in a bit. It's important to know if you walk in the room. Remember our friend Heisenberg? Right? One of the things that Heisenberg taught us is this notion that we used to think that, like, you know, there's one object and there's this object and there's this object and we're all separate, right? But once you start to get quantum mechanics involved in things, you come to find out that all these particles, right, the table, as the philosophers and physicists will tell you, the table is mostly just like thin air, right? It's just not really real. It isn't? No, it's all an illusion. But we have medicine for that. It's okay. Right, this notion that if our bodies really are made up of like molecules and then atoms and then quarks and string theory and so forth and so on, it means that there's a lot of moving parts that are not nearly as solid as we'd like to believe, which means that we're always interacting with something else. So Heisenberg said, you can't both observe a phenomenon without changing the phenomenon that you're observing, because like your very presence is going to interact with that moving presence. We don't believe this. We don't believe that we've been given dominion over the earth. Because if I did, I probably would pay more attention than I do to these things. The interpersonal domain. Attuning to, I'm awake, I'm alert, and I'm attuned, not just to other people being in the room, but to the reality that when you walk in the room, God is looking to bless people with your very presence. You walk in the room, you are a blessing waiting to happen. The question is, am I paying attention to that reality? I have to say, like, I'm not very good at that. I'm not very well practiced at that. Like, I'm always the one who's like, I'm like my temperament is shy by nature. I tend to be, people say, like, you talk in front of these people. I'm like, yeah, because I don't have to have a conversation with them. Like, look, there's like 130 people, but I'm not. It's like at a party where I have to like come up with something to say. Like, if I got a lecture, they got to be quiet for the most part. Right? So, like, how do you, like, with all these things, like, I'm like so self-conscious often. I'm the guy who goes to a party and like, okay, I'm going to have 2 conversations. And I target the people before I even go, right? So that I can like go in, get the job done, get out. It's like commando party man. Right? So like that whole sense of like, not just are we here to serve like the refugee, but do we take seriously the very act of being present and listening to a story, if it's 20 minutes or over 20 days or over 15 years, God is using us to create space within which he is going to do his work. It's easy for me to forget that. It will be easier for me to remember if I am regularly in spaces with people who are reminding me by being known that God is in the middle of this, loving us as he loves through us along the way. Temporal. This notion that we live in a time-space world. We've said, we know, at least we believe that dogs and squirrels think about time. Because otherwise, like, how would squirrels like remember where the nuts were, right? Where did I put my nuts? I gotta go find these things, so I remember, right? There's some sense of memory, but like we don't have the sense that squirrels actually talk with other squirrels about the quality of the nuts that they ate yesterday, right? They don't have thoughts about the past. They're not reflecting on the past. They're not reflecting on the future, as far as we know. We do this, and here's something important to know: eschatology is a really big deal. That's a kind of a fancy schmancy term that we Christians kind of like, and we like to say it. It's a cool word, eschatology, right? Just say that. Walk outside in the street. Hey, what's your eschatology? They're like, dude, like you have like 3 PhDs? But here's the thing. Everybody has one. Everybody has an end time story that we tell. But we may not be paying attention to it. We may not be putting it into language, the recognition that I really don't believe things are going to end well. And the reason that I know that things aren't going to end well much of my day is because I worry. I'm like for real, this is me. Like I'm not Curt, I worry about things. I don't know if that's a good thing or not to know that your shrink is worrying as much as he does, but like I do. And in the moment that I do, the reality is that my eschatology is very different than the one you read about in Revelation. And so part of what I have to do is pay attention to that, to practice visualizing God's eschatology coming forward into my future. And the way that I do that is by being with people who, in embodied ways, remind me that that's actually the case. Here and now. Right, as N.T. Wright would say. Right, the gospel is God's future coming into our present moment and taking everything with it into the future. To what degree are we able to pay attention to that? And then this last one, transpirational, really is this notion. I mean, I don't know, so we've talked about these 8 different domains so far. The hard news is that what we mean by transpiration is the act of paying attention to all of the other 8 domains simultaneously. How easy is that? Right, this is hard. But the good news is, God's not worried about the fact that it's hard. He's not worried. He's working. He's working on our behalf, and he's working through other people. Right? So practicing these things transpirationally means I'm going to practice these things, recognizing that the more that I practice doing these other things to help my neuroplastic brain become more neuroplastically flexible, the more capable I am of allowing these things to become real. Such that I, in real embodied time, like here's the thing, everybody's had trauma, right? Everybody's had trauma. Everybody, in some way, shape, or form. As far as the brain is concerned, everybody's had trauma. Different degrees of this, obviously, different degrees. It means that every time you go anywhere, you become an agent of healing for trauma. You don't have to wait to go to the Middle East to do this. You do this when you have the next conversation with your spouse at dinner tonight. Jesus is never not healing. Neither are we. 14 minutes, right. We have to take time to eat?
Yeah, we're going to take a lot of time to eat.
Right. Well, okay, look, so if you eat a lot less, you just wouldn't need that much time. Emotion. We've already said this, we've alluded to this. Nothing happens that is not emotional in nature. Nothing happens. To the degree that we pay attention to what we feel, it's bottom to top, right to left, we always start conversations with, what do you feel? You can tell me about things, but eventually I'm going to really want to know what your language is telling me about what you feel. I make sense of things after I've felt them. I don't first make my left brain make me feel things. Now, that doesn't mean that my thinking can't shape what I feel. It certainly can. All kinds of evidence for this. Cognitive behavioral therapy. Good stuff. It's important to know, though, that the way the brain's moving all the time, the brain is constantly processing emotion first, then we make sense of it. And here's the challenge. A lot of the problems that we have with our left brain is that we are making the wrong sense of what we feel. One of the things that we make sense of is that we say, like, well, that feeling doesn't matter. That's not important. It's just my feeling, right? Like, that's not what the Bible says. It's just a feeling. Like, here's the thing. If you take feeling out of the equation, human beings stop moving. We stop doing anything. Paying attention to this as we talk with people, as we invite people to tell their stories, we're going to want to know, what did that feel like? I mean, you've been in the field. Like what am I doing? Like, you all are pros. Like, you know what it's like when people talk about what they feel. When we were in South Sudan about 3 years ago, I mean, like, people who had talked about the awfulness of the war with other people, when they sit and talk with other people who are actually paying attention, everything changes in the room. Everything changes. When they don't just like relay events, when they talk, when they put language to their emotional states, everything changes because their brains are being integrated by the very act of someone else listening empathically to them in the moment while they, the listener, are also grounded. Things that many of you already know. Just a word to pay attention to that. Okay. So here's the, now that's all interpersonal neurobiology. And we've got not that much time left. So here's going to be our 10-minute tour through attachment. Now you might think like, not to worry, because when we start to talk about shame and so forth, we're going to be alluding to attachment throughout that whole time, okay? Attachment, just putting it this way, that it is that which we absolutely need in order for human beings to navigate and know how to live in the world. So the kind of definition of attachment from a neuroscience standpoint and from a relational standpoint would be, attachment is the process whereby which the immature infant brain utilizes the allegedly mature adult brain to help organize itself. It is the interpersonal process whereby which the immature infant brain utilizes the mature adult brain to help organize itself. So the way it works, baby is born in the world, comes into the world with a certain temperament, parents respond to this baby in a certain way, and the baby responds to that parent's response. And that baby's response is what we call their attachment. How they attach their parent has everything to do with how they were responding to the parent's approach, the parent's posture toward the child. Now, there's lots of things that shape whether or not a person develops a secure attachment. Many variables. But replicated studies would indicate that there is one variable that stands out before any of them, and that is this. I am more likely to engender a secure attachment in my child to the degree that I, the parent, have made sense of my own story. To the degree that I, the parent, am integrated, I create the likelihood that my child will be more securely attached to me. Like, it's not about like how many parenting classes I went to. It's not about how like I feed my kid. Like, those things are all important. They're all crucially important. But that variable stands out as having more relative power than just about any of the other variables that we know about when it comes to attachment. So here's the question, right? How well integrated is your story? When we are going to help those who are traumatized, we can only offer them what we have. We can only create space for them to have integrated stories, to develop new secure attachments, earn secure attachment to the degree that we are making sense of our story. Now, I want to say this, like, nobody's story is ever completely made sense of, right? We're like on the way to secure attachment. You know, like Kierkegaard. Don't you love that guy's name? But just his name, like Kierkegaard.
We have Danes in the room.
You have Danes in the room? How many Danes do we have? All right, okay, all right. So like Kierkegaard, when I was in college, Kierkegaard was like this wicked smart dude that everybody liked to talk about having read, but who never read, right? We never read him. Because he was like, it was way too like over our head to read it when I was in college. So I've recently become introduced to Kierkegaard again. I started to read Is to Will One Thing. Is to Will One, the Purity of Heart is to Will One Thing, right? It's his collection of essays. You Danes aren't like nodding your head. Oh, yes, we know. Yeah. Right, okay. Anyway, all right. Kierkegaard said this. Kills me. He said, I'm trying to become a Christian. They're like, oh my gosh, that's exactly right. Somebody said, well, Curt, are you a Christian? I was like, well, I'm trying to become one. Right? Because like I know how hard it is to be one. Right? Kierkegaard, like, he got it. That, like, there's always going to be more stuff that's going to be excavated, that's going to demonstrate that, like, my story isn't done being told. Right? Jesus is coming for everything. There will be no stone left unturned in our stories that he is not intent upon redeeming. And like, I got to tell you, I don't really like this notion about God, but like how long it takes for him to do his work. Right? Don't you like? Why can't we just like anybody like if you know like I met Jesus when I was like 21. Like, why wasn't it all done? Why wasn't the whole story packaged and wrapped right then? Why am I still 53 and feeling like, oh my gosh, like, there are parts of me that just feel like I'm waking up. Like, there's no time. I don't have enough time. Like, it's like Gandalf, right, in the Two Towers. 700 years, 700 lives of men have I lived, and now I have no time. This is what it feels like. But God's not worried about this, right? This notion of attachment is a process whereby which we are constantly revealing our stories to those by whom we are being known. Constantly. It is a constant process. And the degree to which we are being known more effectively is the degree to which we create secure attachments. There are a couple of other forms of attachment that we talk about that are insecurely formed. Now, this isn't the place where we have to go into all the detail about all those things, but let's just say trauma does a number on secure attachment. You can be securely attached as a kid and become insecurely attached because of trauma, right? Just because it happens as a kid doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way if you undergo traumatic events that are not resolved. And so part of our task, that's true, part of our task, because traumatic events literally can undo the neural network processes whereby which the things, let me back up. There are 9 processes, I won't get into it, there are 9 processes that we currently understand to be the function of the middle prefrontal cortex. Okay, 9 processes. Those 9 processes, all but one, morality development, we just don't know about the research on this. The other 8 are all highly correlated with secure attachment. I can act in a securely attached way because the middle prefrontal cortex has been highly integrated. But that middle prefrontal cortex integration deeply depends upon my connection in securely attached relationships. And when trauma happens that is unresolved, everything about the middle prefrontal cortex starts to go offline. Does that make sense? Did we say in here before that we are blood and we are dirt and we are breath? And if we're like you can't separate the body from these functional things that we call attachment.
about the infant brain necessarily. It could be about any brain.
Anybody. You can have secure attachment. I mean, okay, here's something that was interesting about 9/11. Some of you might know this. One of the interesting things about the data on 9/11 here in the country was that researchers were surprised at how few people had PTSD. There were a lot of people who did, but like with all the chaos, why wasn't there more? And as they started to look at that data, one of the things that popped up was that there were a fair number of people who actually had secure attachment, who had, before the event, did not have terribly premorbid situations, and after the event, they got good help right away. But I can have traumatic events as an adult, and then if I don't get proper care, I develop insecure attachment. So like this is like what happens when you go to war, right? For like, I mean, like the whole concept, like we go to war and then we come home and like life's supposed to be normal. Like you've seen The Hurt Locker, right? You come like this is how this happens, because attachment is deeply related to the body. And when the body is literally traumatized, we say to people who have these traumas, like your brain has been run over by a truck. Like you weren't like run over by a truck, but your brain metabolically has been. And so what we are doing in trauma work is working to provide secure attachment that is earned, and sometimes it takes a long time for that to happen. But apparently, God is not worried about this. Okay? So real quickly, I have 3 minutes. I'm going to tell one story about one example. Can I do that? Okay. All right. Okay. Here's one example. So he's a 38-year-old pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon. Can I just tell you this, right? Okay, anybody who says you're a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, like it's got to be big time, right? You don't even have to wonder, like, is this cat smart, right? And he comes to my office because his wife has sent him. You're always wondering when the spouse sends, right? Oh, that's right. You're coming so that I can treat your spouse. I get it. So well, here's the norm. They have a 2-year-old son, and his wife is concerned because he wants to have more kids, but she's not pleased at all with how he's treating their 2-year-old son. He comes in for a full psychiatric workup, and his whole workup is clean, right? No depression, no anxiety. Like he is at the top of his game. Ivy League education, top program in the country for his training. He's now one of the rising stars in one of the local large hospital systems doing his work. Everybody loves him, right? His wife will say, everybody loves him. In the church, they love him. Hands of gold, right? Because he's cardiothoracic surgeon. Like he does great work. Kind, humble guy. But his 2-year-old takes him off the grid. His 2-year-old happens to be pretty precocious. Talks. This guy doesn't understand why his 2-year-old won't do what he asks him to do. Now his wife says, like, I don't really quite get it. You're this smart, he's 2. Hello, right? She's one, like, I'm not gonna have more kids if this is what we're doing with your children, so I want you to go see this guy and talk about this. We do the evaluation, and nothing comes up. There are 2 things, though, that really strike me about his story. Number one is that when, as smart as he is, when we talk about feelings, when I ask you about, like, well, what do you feel when this and this, like, he has a very narrow lexicon. Right? He doesn't have any words for emotion. Really smart, not a lot of words for emotion. The second thing is this. As we talked about his life story, he would say, I don't really have a lot of memories of my life before I was about 12 or 13. 2 clues. You've got a guy that's uber smart, but he doesn't remember the first decade of his life that well. So we do this little body scan. That's what we call it. We call it a body scan. No technology is involved. And it's a simple matter of, some of you do things like this, I'm sure. He just sits on the couch, he's relaxed, and we just have him close his eyes. You can imagine a surgeon doing this. Right? Close his eyes, relax, and start to pay attention to his body very systematically. We start at the feet, work our way north, legs, abdomen, so forth and so on, end with the breath. We didn't get that far. We get to his abdomen, and he says, I'm starting to sense things. Images are coming to my mind. It started to come to his mind that were making it hard for him to do this exercise. And so we stopped, and I said, well, what more can you say? And he says, oh my gosh, I'm having a memory. I haven't thought of this in years. He said, I think it was he was about 10 years old, and he pictures himself in his driveway. And his mother and his 2-year-old brother are walking on the sidewalk just before his brother bolts into the street and is hit and killed by a car. Now you got to wonder, this smart, you've asked, any traumatic history in your family, right? Any losses? Nope. Nope. How many siblings do you have? I have 2. He had 3. Now, if you'd asked him point blank, have you ever had an experience in which you've lost a sibling to an automobile accident? He would have said yes, because he remembers it as a fact. He does not remember it as an autobiographical experience, because his parents, as it turned out, were really, they were people of faith, really important to have their kids like believing in Jesus, going to the, working hard at school, which of course he's done all his life. We don't pay much attention to emotion. And in this sense, his attachment was formed in such a way that emotional states didn't really get much airplay. Does that make sense? It's striking, isn't it? That he's so effective in all of life, but his 2-year-old son is starting to drive him crazy. He's smart enough to know that his 2-year-old son is just a 2-year-old. He's not, he can't reason. The guy knows. It sets him off. And the guy himself knows, this is a problem, but he thinks the way that we should solve this is just to get his 2-year-old to obey him. This would be an example of avoidant attachment that rode into what we call dismissing attachment. These different forms that you can read about in different places. But the point is this, is that until and or unless he was going to be able to integrate emotional states that are reflective of that kind of sadness, that kind of traumatic loss, he was going to be at a point where he was not going to be able to be around 2-year-olds. And in fact, his wife was going to have no more kids if this is what he's going to do. This is a small example of the kind of stuff, of the work that you do. We're dealing with people who have all these kinds of traumatic events and histories and so forth that shift their attachment in such a way that we go to people who are traumatized and we think, oh, of course you'll want help. Right? And they might. The problem is their brain might have a really hard time accepting it. And they won't know this because of the story that they tell. Does that make sense? Which is why it takes so long to build relationship, to allow people to come to a place where their attachment, though it is especially traumatized, sometimes disorganized, that we can help usher them into a place of more secure attachment. Okay? Now we're going to see when we come back, we're going to talk about what the specifics are about shame as it plays a role in trauma, and what it means for healing communities to make a difference in that global neurobiological event. You've been very kind. Thank you. I think we'll stop, okay?